Good evening, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Sports Exchange. My name is Scott Morgan, Roth Motor City Mad Mouth. Glad to have George Eichorn back for our weekly broadcast. Good evening, George.
Good evening, Scott. Good to be here again tonight.
And we want to welcome back Tom Shanahan. Tom did a lot of work with us earlier in the year talking about college basketball and college football. And I had the good fortune of meeting Tom over in 2019 over the NSMA banquet and awards dinner, and Tom obviously was promoting the book then. And I'm glad to have you back on our platform.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. Let's talk about the Spartans.
You bet. So, all right, Tom, we'll talk about the Big Ten Network through the banks of the Red Cedar. Why don't you go ahead and go into more detail about that, please?
Yeah, this is real encouraging. The film, the documentary is called Through the Banks of the Red Cedar, and it's produced and written and directed everything by Maya Washington, who has a Hollywood background, writer and actress. And she is the daughter of Gene Washington, college football Hall of Famer, Michigan State.
Yeah.
One of the Underground Railroad passengers on the great 1965 and 1966 national championship teams. And she did a documentary. It's largely a father-daughter story about how her father, Gene, escaped segregation by Michigan State coach Duffy Daugherty recruiting him along with Bubba Smith and other players from the South, and how it changed the family's life and its future to escape segregation, the opportunity that Gene had at Michigan State, and how he turned that into a pro football career, and then he was a long-time executive. He was with 3M Company and a couple of other Minneapolis companies. He stayed in the Minnesota area. It's largely a story about their father-daughter relationship in football, but she gets into enough of the Underground Railroad story about how Michigan State was a pioneering school in the integration of college football. There's no major college that did more for the integration of college football than Michigan State. And that's well documented in my book, Raye of Light. And there's a lot of myths, things that we can get into as the show progresses about Bear Bryant and the 1970 USC-Alabama game that keeps getting regurgitated in the national media, most recently by ESPN before the 2020 season started. So that's why it's so encouraging that the Big Ten Network has decided to show this, because the Big Ten Network up until now really hasn't shown much interest in telling the story of Duffy Daugherty, who is the true pioneer and true leader of college football integration.
That's a great story to be told, that's for sure. I mean, obviously, Gene Washington, like you said, is a Hall of Famer, Tom, and the whole thing about the Underground Railroad and the African American community, what they went through, obviously to seek social justice. It's a long struggle, and that sounds like a wonderful documentary, like you said. I'm looking forward to seeing it.
Yeah, I should have added, it's 8 p.m. Tuesday night, Big Ten Network. So tune in live or set your DVR or whatever it is. I've seen it. Maya's taken it around the country for a while now, and showed it in different cities, different locations. And I saw it about maybe 3 years ago. I think it was 2 years ago. And it is, like I said, it's very well done. And the Big Ten Network has finally picked up on it. Better late than never, I guess. And I'm excited that they're going to show it and give this film its due justice.
Well, before I forget, Scott and Tom, I used to be on the board of directors of the Michigan Sports Hall of Fame. And I tell you, I was not proud. And I'll tell you why. Because so many years we had Gene Washington nominated and talked about him as a Hall of Famer. And my gosh, he was in the College Football Hall of Fame. And I couldn't get some of these Michigan Sports Hall of Fame directors off the dime and support Gene Washington to be in the Michigan Hall of Fame here, which used to be located in our convention center called Cobo Hall, which is now called TCF Center. And Scott, what a great man and great career Gene Washington had. And I thought it was just a crying shame that some people were blind to that and couldn't see Gene's contributions, on the field, off the field. What a professional career, what a great college, obviously All-American guy. And now you've reiterated that by telling me and Scott more about this documentary and just how much he and his family endured and went through. So I just wanted to say that, Gene Washington is obviously one of the greatest Sparties of all time.
Yeah, I've been on Hall of Fame committees. I know how frustrating they are, that people have their favorites and people that seem like they're obvious choices have trouble getting on there. Another example of that is Clint Jones, who's also in the College Football Hall of Fame. He didn't make the Michigan State Hall of Fame until, I think it was 2014.
Wow.
I'm not sure. And then he went into the College Football Hall of Fame in 2015. So yeah, Clinton should have been in that inaugural Michigan State Hall of Fame class in 1992, along with Bubba Smith and George Webster.
Oh,
and then
yeah.
Gene Washington should have been too.
Yeah.
There's when George Webster went in first into the Hall of Fame, College Football Hall of Fame, I think in 1987, 86. Bubba Smith went in a year later. Then Gene Washington went in another 20 years later, and then Clint Jones a couple years after that. Well, once all four of them were in, those were the four All-Americans from the 65 and 66 teams, plus Bob Appiza. He was also an All-American. Once those four went in, it was the first time four players from same senior class, four black players, I should say, from the same senior class ever made the College Football Hall of Fame. And It was the first, and that's for four black players. But in addition, it was the first time four seniors from the same class from any school had made it since 1940. And I think it was Boston College. So it's a very rare accomplishment.
It is indeed. Scott?
So, Tom, when you talk about this particular documentary, what about other conferences? Do you think that any other conferences will be able to acknowledge some of their African American players in a manner that Michigan State has done?
Well, that's part of the problem, Scott, is the school itself has not done a good job.
Right.
And a lot of the Southeastern Conference schools have done a good job. Kentucky has a statue of the four African Americans that were the first black players at their school. They were the first. Kentucky was the first SEC school to integrate. They recruited two black players as freshmen in 1966 and two more as freshmen in 1967. Now you have to remember, back in those days, freshmen were ineligible. So
Yeah.
the first time a black athlete played at a Kentucky varsity game was 1967. But the four of them in those first two classes, Kentucky put up a statue of the four of them about, I'd say 5 years ago. And that's how they have honored them. And at Auburn, Auburn's first black player was James Owens. And he was a freshman in 1969, played his first varsity game in 1970. That's a year before Alabama and Bear Bryant in both cases. He was recruited a year ahead of, let me draw a blank, not Wilbur Marshall, he's the old Chicago Bear. Wilbur Jackson was recruited in 1970, and then was Alabama's first black player in 1971. So Auburn was actually ahead of Alabama, even though Alabama gets all the credit nationally because of the Bear Bryant mythology. So Auburn has honored James Owens with the James Owens Courage Award. That is a special honor that goes to an Auburn athlete each year. At SMU, Jerry Levias was the first black scholarship player in the Southwest Conference. And every year, the player of the most character who represents football at the university and his community wears Jerry Levias's number 23. But you won't find anything at Michigan State. There's no statues of Duffy Doherty, not of the players. And something particularly egregious, and this bothers a lot of the players, and it bothers me, I shouldn't just say that, is if at Jennison Fieldhouse, they have a plaque outside the Fieldhouse for the 1963 Mississippi State Loyola Chicago game. It was called the Game of Change because Mississippi State had to sneak out of the state to play their NCAA tournament game, which by coincidence was at Michigan State, Jennison Fieldhouse. They were the host. Loyola Chicago that year went on to win the NCAA title with 4 black starters. So this was a monumental game. This segregated school that the previous 2 years would not let them participate in the NCAA tournament decided they were going to sneak out of town to get to Michigan State in time to play the game. And Michigan State has a marker about how this was a transformative moment in college sports. But really, Michigan State had nothing to do with it. It just happened to be played at Jennison Fieldhouse because it was an NCAA tournament site.
Yeah.
And so we're honoring 2 other schools and not our own players, our own pioneers.
Yeah. Yeah.
It is a shame that Michigan State is really far behind the 8 ball.
Yeah.
Based on the information, Tom, that you're providing us. It really
Yeah,
is.
actually, I one of my stories on my website, a guy responded with a letter. He was at that Game of the Change when they debuted the plaque. Michigan State played. I think it was one of the historically black colleges. I think in Alabama. And they also honored the Tuskegee Airmen. And one of the guys who read one of my stories and made a comment on it was when he was at that game, he thought they were honoring Michigan State's pioneering history. It wasn't until later he realized Michigan State had nothing to do with it except that it was played at Jennison Fieldhouse, and he was pretty angry that Michigan State wasn't a part of it and hasn't done anything to honor the people that should be honored.
Yeah. And Tom, are you familiar with the story about Gerald Ford, President Ford, and Willis Ward over at the University of Michigan? I think it was back in 1934 that Michigan was playing Georgia Tech, and they were refusing to play the game because Willis Ward was a black teammate. And Gerald Ford, of course, the center on that team, went to bat for his African-American teammate, Willis Ward. I know that's up the road a little bit at Ann Arbor, but that was a great story too, that I know that many people have talked about and they've, done stories on. But again, it was like a real dark day. And, that was back in, I believe, 34, that Michigan, University of Michigan at least, stood up and said, we're going to support this kid on our team.
Yeah. Some schools, that's a great story. Some schools stood up and others did back down.
All right, so let's talk about Magic Johnson. And I don't know this because I've been away from the area.
Yeah.
Is there a statue in East Lansing with Magic Johnson? Obviously, I think the best athlete ever at Michigan State.
Yeah, there's one. There's a very nice one. It's outside of the Breslin Center. And it's well deserved. It should be out there. The Magic has done so much for that university.
And another guy who does a lot for that university, even as a spokesperson, kind of is our friend Scott Gregory Kelser.
Right.
Greg Kelser has been with George Blaha television announcing the Pistons for a long, long time. And Greg Kelser is such a great pro. One of our shows that we had recently with Kurt David talked about, Gregory Kelser and what a great guy he is. And obviously there's many, many more at Michigan State, but Kelser obviously was a teammate of Magic Johnson's.
Yeah, he was great. Special K.
Yeah.
Well, now you're getting into Tom's area of expertise with college. All right, so Tom, let's go to Michigan State. You say they led college football integration under Duffy Doherty. Why don't you elaborate on that, please?
Yeah, like you mentioned the story about Michigan and Gerald Ford. What separated Michigan State and Duffy Doherty from other colleges that were integrated was he didn't limit his roster to 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 black players. So that made Michigan State the first fully integrated football team in college football. In 1962, the Associated Press reported that the 17, and this was the word they used back in those days, the 17 Negro athletes was the largest delegation of Negro athletes in the history of major college football. Well, 17, that's nothing by today's standards, but back then it was a lot because schools limited themselves to just 4 or 5 black players. They wanted a skill player and a couple of others. And they only took a black player if he was a sure thing, so to speak. In today's vernacular, a 5-star recruit. They didn't take chances on guys. Duffy always took chances on guys. A good example, and people are always surprised to hear this, Minnesota won the 1960 national title with a famously integrated team, but they only had 5 black players. 1962, USC, long history of integration, won the national title, 5 black players, that's it. 1967, USC wins another national title, O.J. Simpson. Everybody thinks about that as a black team because they had black stars. There are only 7 black players on the entire roster. Los Angeles, and think of how large and diverse Los Angeles is. 1966 game of the century. Michigan State plays Notre Dame. Michigan State has 20 black players, 11 black starters. Notre Dame only has 1 black player on the entire team, Alan Page. And, USC, Minnesota, and Notre Dame, that was the norm back then. But people saw what Duffy Daugherty was doing with black talent, winning 65 and 66 national titles. Remember, the 65 team would have played in the January 1st, 1966 Rose Bowl before a vast television audience, because back then the Rose Bowl was the college game. It was the most highly rated game. And then 11 months later, they played Notre Dame in the game of the century, November 19th, 1966. 33 million people tuned into that game. It was a record TV audience, larger than the Super Bowl the first Super Bowl that was played 2 months later in Los Angeles. And so Michigan State, visibility is viability. People saw all these black athletes, and then you started seeing schools in the South starting to break down their barriers. Kentucky had their first black players in 1967. Tennessee in 1968. Florida, 1968. Auburn, 1970. Alabama, Bear Bryant, Bear Bryant dragged his feet until 1971, even though he gets so much credit. USC, as I said, they only had 7 black players in 1967, but by their 1972 national championship team, they had 23 black players.
Wow.
And Notre Dame, next national championship in 1977, they had 13 black players. So it all changed with what people saw on TV from Michigan State in the Rose Bowl at the game of the century. But unfortunately, a narrative took place that is mostly fiction, that the 1970 USC-Alabama game was a turning point, and it was not a turning point. The game was not even on TV.
Wow, that's incredible.
Yeah, which segues us, Tommy, to the next thing, why the 1970 USC-Alabama game is fiction. You talked about Bear Bryant's apologist. USC's fiction stole true to what, 1960 pioneers. It's a great story. Why don't you elaborate on that?
Yeah, on my website, and I have a new website since the last time I've been on. I've kind of updated it. It's just tomshanahan.report.com. But I wrote a story about, my book focuses on how Michigan State has been overshadowed by this 1970 USC Alabama's fiction. But as I spoke to Jerry Levias, I started doing some more interviews. I always wanted to write more about Bubba Smith's father, Willie Ray Smith, who was a very prominent black high school coach in the Houston area. He won 235 games and 2 black state titles in his career. And he sent a lot of players to Duffy, his son Bubba and Gene Washington being 2 of the most prominent. Uh, so from talking about Willie Ray Smith, learning more about him, I talked to Jerry Levias, and he started telling me about how important Duffy Daugherty was to the integration of college football, and that if it wasn't so cold, he would have gone to Michigan State because Willie Ray Smith tried to push him towards Michigan State. But once Hayden Fry, who was then SMU's coach, offered him a chance to stay closer to home in Texas, that he broke ground in Texas. That led me to the Kentucky players, and I'm talking to Wilbur Hackett. He was, of those 4 black players that were the first 4 in the SEC from Kentucky, Wilbur Hackett was the most successful. He was an all-SEC player and a team captain. And he told me that he gets angry when he sees these documentaries about Bear Bryant and the 1970 USC game leading college football integration. Yeah, he says it's just not true, and it completely overlooks Kentucky. And one time he saw a story on CBS and tried to call the network to correct him, but nobody called him back. Next, I talked to Lester McLean, who was the first black player at Tennessee. And he, in 1968, so his senior year was 1970. And Lester said that he also gets angry when he sees these documentaries praising Bear Bryant and Alabama for something they did not do. He says, heck, by 1970, I was almost out of college. How can Alabama be getting credit for recruiting black athletes? And that's the other point I try to make also. Why are we celebrating Bear Bryant for waiting until until 1971 for his first black player? He recruited him in 1970. Again, freshmen who were ineligible by NCAA rules until 1972. It's such an incomprehensible that with the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King, and just being a decent human being like Jerry Ford in the 1930s, that you would wait until 1971 to give a black man a chance to play college football.
Yeah, you hit on recruiting a little bit, Tom. Do you think the coaches? I mean, was there just a fear factor for a lot of them that they didn't want to go into the black person's home or go into the gridirons where these kids were practicing and working out? I mean, were there a lot of obstacles there in the recruiting area, do you believe?
I think a lot of it had to do that if all the coaches are white, back then everything was word of mouth. There was no internet. There were no recruiting magazines. It's nowhere near as sophisticated as it is now. So everything was word of mouth. And if your entire coaching staff is white, who are the high school coaches they know? Other white coaches.
Yeah.
So they just didn't come across very many black athletes. And then, of course, in the SEC, they just didn't even recruit those didn't even visit the black high school campuses at all. They just completely ignored them because and so I think that was part of it. Part of it was in pressure from alumni and boosters, and then part of it was it was kind of an unwritten quota that they would only have 4 or 5.
Oh, jeez.
There was a famous Duffy Daugherty story. This is in my book. Duffy's son Danny told me this story, that Duffy was at a post-game party in 1965, and remember Jimmy Ray was a sophomore quarterback backup to Steve Jude, the All-American. And this booster comes up to Duffy and says, we're winning lots of games with these black players you have. That's okay. But if you start a black quarterback, that's too much. We're not going to be friends anymore. And Duffy turned to his wife and said, grab our coats. We're leaving. They left the party, and he told the guy on the way out, you don't have to wait till next year when Jimmy Ray became the starter. We're no longer friends now.
Oh, wow.
So it took a man like Duffy to stand up to boosters and quotas, unwritten rules, and just to do the right thing.
Yep.
All right, so Tom, let's talk about the fact that USC was not the model of a fully integrated roster. You alluded to the fact that 5 black starters, people didn't even know about that. Why don't you go into more detail?
Yeah, well, that's part of the whole myth and fiction of the 1970 USC Alabama game, And one thing to remember about this, and I write about this in my story, is the myth didn't even start until the late 1980s. And a USC assistant coach, Craig Fertig, and a USC player on that 1970 team, John Papadakis, a white guy, they made up the story. They were John Papadakis was trying to write a movie script. They made up the story, and then it just snowballed from there. It got into the newspapers out in Los Angeles, and then other newspapers wrote about it. Nobody ever checked the facts. It just snowballed. And when I started doing my research for Raye of Light, I've always heard that story too about Bear Bryant. And then I looked a little closer at the roster, and I said, wait a minute, 1970, they only have USC with its long history of integration, Los Angeles, a hugely populous area, widely diverse. And they only had 5 black starters as late as 1970. And then I looked at the 5 black starters. The quarterback was Jimmy Jones, and he was from Pennsylvania. Excuse me. Jimmy Jones was from Pennsylvania. The fullback, Sam Cunningham, was from Santa Barbara. So near Los Angeles, but not a Los Angeles high school. Charlie Weaver, who went on to play for the Lions, he was from Richmond, California, in the Bay Area.
Yeah.
And then Tony Smith, the defensive end, Bubba's little brother, he was a Michigan State transfer. The only guy that was from a Los Angeles high school, black starter, was Clarence Davis, and he was a junior college transfer. So to me, it's baffling. How is it possible to not have more black players with all the talent that was in Los Angeles playing on that team? Well, they just didn't open their doors until they saw what Duffy Daugherty was doing. And like I said, 1967, national title, 7 black players. By 1970, they had 5. They did have 18 black players on the team. They had increased their numbers by then. But, back then, nobody left early for the NFL. So the guys who played were the seniors and juniors. And so they only had 5 black starters. They had 18 overall. And then, like I said earlier, by their next national title in 1972, they had 23 black players. So nobody was a fully integrated roster like Michigan State was in the 60s. And it's just terrible that this myth and fiction about USC and Alabama, designed to protect Bear Bryant's true record of dragging his feet on integration. His apologists are trying to protect his record. And then from USC's standpoint, where the myth actually started, they're just trying to aggrandize their role in this great game that was not on TV. Nobody knew. The only people that knew what happened on a Saturday night in Birmingham, Alabama, were listening to one of the 2 radio networks.
So, Tom, when we look at black quarterbacks in general, how important was it for Doug Williams to become a Super Bowl winning quarterback? I know that you talked about the Duffy Daugherty situation, and I commend Duffy for his stance there, but Doug Williams is a pioneer of sorts in the NFL, winning with the Washington Redskins, and he's stayed around the game a long time. And before he got to the Redskins, he was quite successful with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, leading him to an NFC championship game.
Yeah, Doug was a pioneer every step of the way. He went to Grab League and wanted to be a quarterback at Grab League and wanted to be the first. Eddie Robinson, the Grab League coach, had turned out many black players into the NFL, but he wanted to be the first starting quarterback. James Harris had been a quarterback from Grab League, but he never got the attention that Doug Williams got. And so James Harris, Doug Williams wanted to follow in James Harris's footsteps. He was the first round draft pick from Grab League at quarterback, and then a starter with Tampa Bay. And then, of course, he had a contract dispute. They wouldn't pay him fairly. He signed with the USFL, and then Joe Gibbs resurrected his career with the Redskins. So, yeah, Doug Williams has broke down a lot of barriers. It was still quite a while to get to where we are today, but it was an initial first step, no doubt about it.
Yeah, and you mentioned Doug Williams, Scott and Tom, and I don't know if our listeners know that, but in July of 2019, Grambling honored Williams by naming a street in his honor on the college campus. They felt so highly about him. And Williams also founded the Black College Football Hall of Fame.
Yeah, very good point. Yes.
Yeah, and I know that each year several players, from the historically black colleges get inducted and enshrined in that. So, Doug Williams has carried on that legacy. I'm so glad that, you brought his name up, Scott and Tom, because not only a Super Bowl winning quarterback, but boy, oh boy, he's got his roots, and he's done a great job remembering where he came from, like you said, at Grambling State, and obviously born and went to high school in Louisiana, I believe.
I believe he also proceeded to coach Grambling University. I don't know if he's in the NFL again or Grambling, but I know.
You're right, Scott. He did coach Grambling, yeah, from 98 to 2003, correct.
Right, following in Eddie Robinson's footsteps, so to speak. So, it was an important transition for Grambling University football. And I think that's one of the things that people realize, that when you have these black institutions, I think it's important that a lot of these guys don't forget where they came from, and Doug Williams, his career speaks for itself.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, that was the 87 when he was the first black quarterback to win a Super Bowl, the 87 season.
Right.
And then, of course, that knocked down some barriers, and then you started seeing more and more black quarterbacks, and now it's common. Now, the difference, though, is the change hasn't been as successful with black coaches. We still have very few black head coaches. And that's part of the Michigan State story, too, that Duffy hired Sherman Lewis in 1969.
Oh, yeah.
Actually, the first black coach Duffy hired was Don Coleman, the great All-American, in 1968. And Don wasn't really a coaching guy. He did it for a year, and he didn't want to do it again. And Sherman Lewis, who had played briefly for the New York Jets. Sherman Lewis was the 1963 All-American for Duffy Doherty at Michigan State, a running back, third place in the Heisman Trophy voting that year. He was the first underground All-American for Duffy Doherty. But anyway, Sherman had played briefly with the New York Jets and was back home in Louisville coaching at a high school. And Duffy called him up and said to ask him to come up and coach. So he adds Sherman Lewis as one of the first black college coaches in 1969, and then Jimmy Raye is was still one of the first black coaches in 1972 on Duffy's staff. And then both Sherman and Duffy went on to the NFL, had long careers, never got their chance as a head coach. Both of them got cursory interviews that weren't serious interviews. They were just so the owner could say, I interviewed a black coach candidate.
Yeah,
and nothing has really changed since then. Look what happened last year with Eric Bieniemy. He couldn't get a job, but Joe Judge, who was the special teams coordinator at the New England Patriots, gets the New York Giants job.
Well, with all due respect to Eric Bieniemy, it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. He'll get hired.
Well, they've been saying that for 2 years now, though.
Yeah, but you know what, though? I guarantee, I have a feeling that if we do this when we do this broadcast a year from now, Eric Bieniemy will be roaming in NFL sidelines. He's one of the hottest coaching candidates. But I see your point about the Rooney Rule. Is it doing enough right now? You don't know if it really is. I know Matt Millen, got fined a hefty amount. The Fords certainly try to defend what they've done. But you're right. Has the Rooney Rule gone far enough? For every Tony Dungy out there, how many? It's difficult to find African American quarterbacks.
And then look at the situation with Jim Caldwell. He did a nice job, as we know, in Detroit, and then he got the shaft when Quinn decided to bring his buddy over, Matt Patricia from New England.
Yeah, but your problem with Jim Caldwell is when Lions have full-time head coaches, they never get hired. So whether it's Jim Caldwell or not, but Jim Caldwell certainly did a fine job with the Lions, without a doubt.
Yeah.
If you leave Detroit, you don't get rehired again. I mean, I thought even Jim Schwartz, I thought, deserved a second chance, and he hasn't. So, but that'll be for another date down the line.
That's another time, yeah.
But
Dennis, Dennis Franklin, your thoughts on him, Tom? You know, of course, he's probably the first black quarterback at the University of Michigan. Again, the Wolverines, haven't had many African-American quarterbacks at all in their history.
Well, yeah, he was a great quarterback, great player for that. He was a running quarterback, though, of course.
Yeah.
But that was Bo's offense. He wasn't going to throw the ball anyways. He wasn't looking for someone with an arm. The difference now is colleges recruit black quarterbacks to throw the ball. They got to. That's the way the game is played. But back then, they would only they basically took a running back and made him a quarterback in their option offenses. So
yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. And I know that certainly Duffy Daugherty, like you said, stands head and shoulders above so many other coaches and all that, because what a wonderful man. I know that Spartans announcer George Blaha always spoke so highly, and still does, obviously. He's still on the air calling the games about Duffy Daugherty and about Sherm Lewis that you mentioned. And what a great man Sherm Lewis was. Don Coleman, another member of the Michigan Sports Hall of Fame, Don Coleman. And Jimmy Raye, of course, successful career, like you said, in the NFL as a coach. It's just it's a shame, like you said earlier, that we have such trouble honoring, and remembering these memories and these legacies. And I'm so glad that you are doing that, Don.
yeah, in one of the chapters in my book, I talked to Sherman about how he wanted to be the Michigan State head coach. And Jimmy Raye did too. Jimmy was in the NFL. He had left for the NFL by 1970s. Here's another point. Jimmy was with Michigan State, and he went to the NFL in 1977 with the 49ers. It was 30 teams in the league, maybe 28, but I think it was 30. In the entire league, Jimmy was only the 8th black assistant coach.
Wow.
That's how slow the league was.
Yeah.
To hire black assistant coaches, let alone a head coach.
Yeah.
And but Sherman had stayed longer at Michigan State, so you had he was on the staff with Duffy, 69, stayed with through Denny Stoles, stayed with through Darrell Rogers, and then Darrell Rogers both from Arizona State, and Sherman, I think it was like 38 at the time. And he'd been, so this is 1980, I think. And he'd been an assistant coach since 1969. And he wanted the head coaching job. And who do we hire? We hired Muddy Waters.
Oh, yeah. Who had
that turned out to be.
Had a great career at the lower level. Yeah. With, what was Grand Valley State or wherever he was at?
Hillsdale and Saginaw Valley.
Oh, Hills. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, but Sherman was confident he could have put together a great staff, could have recruited, and but they didn't even consider him. And instead, they consider Muddy Waters, who's 57 years old and not up for the job.
Right.
And,
right.
And it's just a shame. Yet, part of the problem too is after Duffy and Biggie Bud, and then. With that, I'm drawing a blank on our president, Michigan State's president all those years, John Hanna. After all those guys left, you had a lot of outsiders who didn't understand Michigan State's history. They didn't understand that Michigan State led the way. And heck, they might have heard somewhere else about USC and Alabama and Bear Bryant and just have no awareness at all of what Michigan State did, and haven't bothered to look closely either.
So let's move forward a little bit. Nick Saban leaves Michigan State to go to I believe it was at LSU, if I remember right. Bobby Williams gets hired as head coach for Michigan State.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts about Bobby Williams becoming the head coach at Michigan State when, in retrospect, Jimmy Raye and Sherm Lewis, all these guys should have, but Bobby Williams gets that opportunity as an African-American head coach at Michigan.
Yeah. Bobby was the interim head coach, and they won the bowl game. The players said they wanted him to be their head coach. So there was nothing wrong with making him the head coach. he was well positioned for it. Problem was he just didn't turn out to be a head coach. He's a good assistant coach. And but the other guy, the one guy that Michigan State did pursue was Tyrone Willingham, but not until after he had success at Stanford. And when they did pursue him, Tyrone just wasn't ready to take the job. He did try the Notre Dame job, which backfired on him. They only gave him 3 years. And so that was a sad story. But yeah, here's 3 pioneering black coaches: Sherman Lewis, Jimmy Raye, Tyrone Willingham, and neither one of them ever got a chance to coach at their alma mater. Sherman Lewis said it would have been the greatest thing that ever happened to him if he was the head coach at Michigan State.
Yeah.
And here we are in 2020. We have Mel Tucker in charge of these programs.
Yeah. Yeah. What are your thoughts about Mel Tucker?
Mel Tucker is doing a great job. You can't judge anything on this season because of COVID.
Oh,
You look around the entire, the Big Ten's only been playing 3 weeks, and people are trying to figure out what is going on here. Michigan State looks terrible against Rutgers. They beat Michigan, and they look terrible against Iowa, and then Michigan loses 2 in a row. You look around, every conference has experienced that, with just results that are just too hard to explain. And it's because they didn't have spring football. They didn't have the off-season programs. And then for Michigan State, Mel Tucker was even worse because he didn't get hired until February. If you're a new head coach, usually you're coming in December, and you're at least getting to know the players while they're in school in January and February. You're meeting with them, you're talking to them, and then spring football starts. Well, he didn't have that. He gets hired in February, and then the campus is shut down a month later. So he was way behind in trying to establish his program.
yeah.
But like I say, it's not just Michigan State. It's everywhere. The only exceptions are Clemson and Alabama, and that's because they just have overwhelming talent. This just is an era of the internet, and the kids all follow, the 5-star kids all follow each other. They don't care where the school is. They just want to go there because that's where you're going to win a national championship. And there's no better example of that than Tua Tagovailoa. Who the heck goes from Hawaii to Alabama? Why would you do that? I don't even care if it's to win a national championship. I wouldn't move from Hawaii to Alabama. And
He did.
So, and he did. And there's another problem with Michigan State. When Duffy Daugherty retired and Denny Stoles took over the program, one of his first things he did was sever the Hawaiian pipeline that Duffy had established. Duffy had been recruiting players out of Hawaii since the 50s. Then Baba Pisa was the first Samoan All-American. And that just launched the wave of Polynesian athletes that are just all over college, NFL, and high school football nowadays.
It's funny how you talk about Hawaii, Tom. When I was out in Hawaii many years ago, I went to the Hawaiian Polynesian tourist site, the Polynesian. It was pretty interesting to see a lot of those people, and learn about their origin. So my brother my brother told me it may not be one of the best places you've ever gone, but you got to check it out. I did. And I could say it was an education, to say the least. Let's talk about the Black Lives Matter movement, and then our final thing of the night will be promoting your book. So, what are your thoughts about the Black Lives Matter movement?
Well, I think it's excellent, and I think it's brought a lot of awareness to people. A lot of people are resistant, and if they are, they're not paying attention. They're not accepting what Black people have to go through. That it's just routine for them to be pulled over by a cop and to have their car searched. And if you're white and you don't appreciate that, you're just closed-minded. I applaud all the athletes that have gotten organized and haven't been afraid to voice their opinions. We went through a long period of time where athletes, all they worried about was their brand, and they wouldn't speak up and give their opinions. Michael Jordan, of course, being the worst offender of all. He said the Republicans like to buy shoes too. So he wouldn't endorse a black candidate, Harvey Gantt, in North Carolina for senator against Jesse Helms, who was a longtime and well-known racist. And his excuse for not endorsing Harvey Gantt was that Republicans buy shoes too. That's all he cared about.
Oh, geez.
Very interesting.
Unbelievable. Well, and a lot of the, some, not a lot of them, but some of the privileged, if you will, black athletes, you're right. They don't seem to give as much back to the community or to some of the causes. And that does get them in trouble. You mentioned Michael Jordan. I know LeBron James, people think he should probably be doing more. He has spoken up in the last several months, of course, but you bring up a good point, Tom. I mean, it's a matter of making sure that these issues are at the forefront.
Yeah, LeBron James is a great example too. Another story that reminds me of another story that's in my book and also on my website. If you go to my website, there's a story, Overlooked Pioneers of the 1960s. In 1961, Alabama was ranked number 1 in the nation. And there was a lapse in the contract between the Big Ten and the Pac-12, which back then had a different name. It was the AIAW, something like that. And so Bear Bryant was working a backroom deal to go to the Rose Bowl with his number 1 ranked team. And the commissioner of the Pac-12 at the time was a friend of his, a guy named Admiral Tom Hamilton. And because of the contract lapse, they thought they could pull this off. Well, word had leaked that that Bear Bryant was doing this. Excuse me, I'm going to have to.
That's okay. Take your time.
My allergy is kind of popping up on me here.
That's all right.
Word leaked out to the black players. UCLA had won the Pac-12 for lack of a better title for it. And word had leaked out, and the black players, led by Kermit Alexander, who went on to play in the NFL, they said they would not play against Alabama. They wouldn't take the field. And some UCLA students also protested. Now, but keep in mind, this is 1961, so the media didn't really cover it. It was just a story that kind of leaked out. And Jim Murray, the great Los Angeles Times columnist, Pulitzer Prize winner, he got word of it, and he actually went to Alabama before they played Georgia Tech to confront Bear Bryant about what he was trying to do behind the scenes. And Bear Bryant wouldn't comment about it. But once Jim Murray wrote about it in the Los Angeles Times, then it became public knowledge, and the Rose Bowl backed off, and Minnesota came out. It's a confusing story. A lot of people get confused with Alabama possibly being invited because Ohio State turned down its invitation. Ohio State was the Big Ten champion, and the faculty had the power back then to vote that Ohio State would not attend the Rose Bowl. The faculty was fearful in 1961 that Woody Hayes was turning the school into a football factory. And if you think about how Ohio State led lifting of the COVID postponement, I guess they were right, because Ohio State is a football factory. But anyways, so people get confused that was the reason Alabama almost got in. It wasn't the reason, because the Rose Bowl withdrew its invitation or came out and said they weren't considering Alabama before Ohio State beat Michigan to clinch the Big Ten title, and then a few days later declined the invitation. So Minnesota ended up coming out to the Rose Bowl for the second straight year, because they had won the Big Ten title the year before, despite the no repeat rule.
Yeah.
But anyways, this is a significant story where the UCLA black players stood up with the support of Jim Murray. But back in those days, the media just they stayed away from black issues. They didn't want to write about it. They didn't, for two reasons. They were afraid of offending their readers and advertisers.
Yeah.
So it's not a very well-known story. But
Yeah.
it's one of the best stories ever of black athletes putting up a protest and succeeding.
All right, I've
Yeah.
got to ask this question because as I continue to absorb a lot of what you're saying, Tom, how much do you think that the Black Lives Matter affected the recent elections, presidential elections? Because I know throughout 2020, the Black Lives Matter movement has been a contentious situation.
Yeah, well, the black vote, Stacey Abrams in Georgia, she did such a great job of getting people registered and to turn out and vote. You know, for a lot of black people have just felt like it wasn't worth it to them to vote, and they finally, after all that's happened in the past 4 years, and more public awareness, people have seen on, uh, uh, you know, the police killing unarmed black men is nothing new. Seeing it done on film, a cop having a knee on a guy's neck for 8 or 9 minutes, whatever it was, that is new. So a portion of the American public now understands what Black Lives Matter is about and why it's justified to feel that the police overstep their bounds. There's still going to be a lot of people that won't go along with it, but just the public awareness is so much better now than it ever was.
I'm fine with that. Okay, so Tom, you wrote your book, Raye of Light. Why don't you give everybody an overview of what that book's about and why should they buy it?
Well, it's just the history of college football without Duffy Daugherty and Michigan State and the 1965 team, 66 teams, not only uh, forcing the schools in the South to start keeping their black athletes at home, but schools like USC to push open their doors wider and recruit more black players. Uh, it's Michigan State and Duffy Daugherty and his players. They set the standard. And Willie Ray Smith, Bubba Smith's father, is a key figure in this because he uh, trusted Duffy Daugherty, like the other black coaches in the South, and sent players from the South to play for Duffy because they knew Duffy would take care of them and treat them respectfully.
Yeah. Sounds like a great read.
Yeah,
How do we get how do we get a hold of
Well, you
a
can
copy?
always buy it on Amazon or Barnes and Noble, but the best place to go is August Publications. August, just like the month, and then just augustpublications.com, and you'll find a link to my book, or you can go to my website, tomshanahan.report.com, and there's a link with a quote from Tony Dungy recommending the book. Tony Dungy wrote the foreword for the book.
Yeah, I actually have a copy of that. When I was out I met Tom in 2019, seems like ages ago because we're all stuck here because of COVID-19. It was neat spending time with you, Tommy, when we were out in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. Looking forward to getting back there when we're able to go back to large gatherings. But got a copy of the book, and folks, it's definitely a read. What I call it an impactful read. So we'll figure that should whet your appetite. George Eichorn, meanwhile, has a book too. Go ahead, George.
Yeah, Scott and Tom. My book is called Detroit Sports Broadcasters on the Air, and George Blaha is featured in that book, and Greg Kelser. And I have Van Patrick and Ernie Harwell and Ray Lane and Bud Lynch and Bruce Martin. We cover a lot of the Michigan sports history. Bob Reynolds and Frank Beckman and Scott Morganroth. Scott has got a whole page to himself, deservedly so, Scott. My book is available for about $20 at South Florida Tribune website. There's a link there under my profile page. And you can also reach me at geichorn@yahoo.com. and Twitter at DSBA2.
Right,
Thank you.
I'd like to give everybody your contact information as well.
I'm sorry, were you talking to me, Scott?
Yeah, why don't you give everybody, Tom, your contact information as well?
Well, if you go, the best way to find my website, go on Twitter, and it's Shanny4055. Shanny, just like Shanahan, so SHANNY4055. And there's a link to my website on my Twitter page.
Very good. All right, well, just to give everybody know you are watching the Sports Exchange and listening to it. My name is Scott Morganroth, Motor City Madmouth. Glad to be joined on this episode with George Eichorn and Tom Shanahan. Tom and I have worked together in the past on this platform. Glad to be able to work with him again, and hopefully down the line we'll be able to do it again. George Eichorn, we do this all the time. Then again, we have for the last 40 years, so what's the difference? So a lot
Yeah,
of fun.
And one more time, Tuesday night, 8 p.m. the Big Ten Network. You can watch the documentary on Michigan State by Maya Washington.
And as far as our contact information here, you can follow us on Twitter at Tribune South. That's at Tribune South. Facebook and Instagram, South Florida Tribune Gets It Done. We have a YouTube channel, South Florida Tribune. I'll give you 6 reasons why you should follow it and subscribe to it. We have the Sports Exchange, No Limits, 108 Stitches Baseball Talk, Real and the Rare, Fantasy Football, South Florida Tribune Podcast. So we give you 6 broadcasts for 1 subscribe. Not very bad there at all. Our website is www.southfloridatribune.com. We have the broadcast on that website, the Motor City Monitor. We cover a lot of events in Metro Detroit. Can't forget your roots, and I don't. Okay, then we have affiliates columns as well as contributors columns. So, and all of our broadcasts are on the southfloridatribune.com website as well. You can email us at southfloridatribune@gmail.com. And on LinkedIn, you can find me, Scott Morganroth, there as well. If you want to hear the audio version of the broadcast, you can do so through Apple Podcasts, Spreaker, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Google Podcasts, wherever you get your podcasts. I'll give you an audio replay since everybody says I talk too fast. And the best part about it is they're probably right anyways, okay? Apple Podcasts, Spreaker, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Google Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. So, Tom, it's been a pleasure bringing you back on the broadcast tonight. And it's good to be able to talk about the Michigan State Spartans and Duffy Daugherty. The legacy of Duffy Daugherty, to me, will always be strong up in East Lansing and beyond. So, you know, for all you folks that are looking for a good read, Tom Shanahan, the Raye of Light, is there for you. And, of course, George Eichorn, we talk about Detroit sports broadcasts on the air. I haven't written a book, but at least I'm in one. And although whatever my legacy will be, well, I'll let people down the road determine what that is and really don't care. My legacy should be that I get the best possible people I can on these broadcasts as well. And I feel that I'm fine with that for now. So, meanwhile, any closing thought? George, you want to give everybody the COVID message?
Yes, don't forget to mask up. There's no choice in our minds. Be safe, social distancing, mask up. COVID is breaking out again, record numbers. Michigan, unbelievably bad news in the last several days and weeks here in Michigan as we go higher and higher with COVID cases and unfortunately with the death toll. So again, let's be safe. Don't be stupid. Mask up, social distancing, and just play it safe. Thanks, Scott.
Yeah, you're welcome. I'll be coming up to Michigan a week from Saturday. I know one thing, I can't worry about what the cases are. All I can do is focus on what I can control and mask up and take all the protocols necessary and let things work themselves out. So I like to make my annual trip up there. I'm going to make it anyhow. We just have to play it really, really safe. And I have a busy agenda between now and time that I get up to Metro Detroit. I got Sebring over the weekend. Of course, I have another FAU game. So I have a lot on tap. But with all due respect, follow the protocols. You should be okay. And we'll certainly do everything we can. So great episode tonight between you, George, and Tom Shanahan. We look forward to welcoming Tom back in the very near future. So anyway, on behalf of Tom Shanahan and George Eichorn, my name is Scott Morganroth, the Motor City Madmouth. Thanking you for joining us on this episode of the Sports Exchange. Good night, everybody, and be safe.
Good night.